Picture this. It's the year 476 AD, and the most powerful empire the world has ever known is about to breathe its last breath. For over 1,000 years, Rome has been the beating heart of civilization, the center of art, engineering, law, and culture. Roads stretch across 3 continents, aqueducts carry water to millions, and the Pax Romana has brought unprecedented peace and prosperity. But in just a few decades, all of that is about to crumble into dust, plunging Europe into centuries of chaos, poverty, and darkness. How does the greatest empire in history fall? And more importantly, what happens to the world when it does? Stay with me, because today we're diving deep into one of history's most dramatic transformations, from the glory of Rome to the shadows of the Dark Ages. Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button because we explore the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Today's journey is going to take us through the collapse of an empire and into an era that would define Europe for the next 1,000 years. We're talking about real people, real struggles, and the slow, agonizing death of a civilization that once seemed invincible. So let's set the stage and understand just how magnificent Rome was before everything fell apart. At its height in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire was absolutely staggering in its scope and sophistication. We're talking about an empire that stretched from the windswept highlands of Scotland all the way to the sun-baked deserts of Mesopotamia, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Black Sea. Over 50 million people lived under Roman rule, about 1/5 of the world's entire population at the time. The city of Rome itself was home to over 1 million people, making it the largest city on Earth, and it wouldn't be matched in size by another European city until London in the 19th century. Think about that for a second. Rome was a megas city in an ancient world, with running water, public baths, theaters, massive amphitheaters like the Colosseum, and a level of urban infrastructure that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. The Romans had perfected the art of engineering. Their roads were so well built that some of them are still in use today, 2,000 years later. The famous saying, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't just a metaphor, it was literally true. Over 50,000 miles of paved roads connected every corner of the empire, allowing armies to march, merchants to trade, and information to flow faster than ever before in human history. Their aqueducts were marvels of engineering, carrying fresh water from mountain springs into cities across the empire. Rome itself had 11 major aqueducts supplying the city with hundreds of millions of gallons of water every single day. The Pont du Gard in southern France, which is still standing, is a testament to their engineering genius. A 3-tiered stone bridge that carried water across a valley using nothing but gravity and precise mathematical calculations. But Rome wasn't just about engineering and military might. It was a cultural powerhouse. Latin was the language of educated people across Europe, and Roman law formed the basis for legal systems that we still use today. Concepts like innocent until proven guilty, the right to a fair trial, and written contracts all come from Roman legal tradition. Roman literature, philosophy, and art set standards that would inspire Renaissance thinkers over 1,000 years later. The Romans preserved and built upon Greek knowledge, creating libraries, schools, and a tradition of learning that kept knowledge alive and spreading. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean, with goods flowing from India, China, Africa, and every corner of the known world into Roman markets. If you were a citizen of Rome, you could eat exotic spices from the East, wear silk from China, and read philosophy from Greece, all while living under the protection of the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. So what happened? How does something so powerful, so advanced, so seemingly eternal just collapse? Well, the truth is, Rome didn't fall in a day. It was a slow decline, a death by 1,000 cuts that played out over centuries. And to understand the fall, we need to understand the cracks that started appearing long before the empire's final collapse. Let's rewind a bit and look at the warning signs. The first major issue was the sheer size of the empire. By the 3rd century AD, Rome had expanded so far that it was becoming almost impossible to govern effectively. Communication was slow, even with those amazing roads. It could take weeks for a message to travel from the frontier to Rome, and by the time orders came back, the situation on the ground might have completely changed. The empire needed a massive military to defend its borders, and that military was expensive. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed along thousands of miles of frontier, from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the Rhine and Danube rivers in Europe, to the deserts of North Africa and the Near East. Every soldier needed to be fed, equipped, trained and paid, and all of that came out of the imperial treasury. And here's where things start to get tricky. To pay for this massive military, Rome needed tax revenue, lots of it. But by the 3rd century, the economy was starting to stagnate. The days of easy conquest were over. Rome had already conquered most of the known world, and there weren't many wealthy kingdoms left to plunder. Without new sources of wealth flowing in, the empire had to tax its existing population more heavily. But higher taxes meant people had less money to spend, which hurt economic growth, which meant less tax revenue, which meant even higher taxes. It's a vicious cycle, and Rome was caught right in the middle of it. Then there was the problem of political instability. The 3rd century AD is often called the crisis of the 3rd century, and for good reason. In just 50 years, from 235 to 284 AD, Rome had over 50 different emperors. Most of them were murdered, overthrown, or died in battle. This wasn't just political chaos, it was complete institutional breakdown. Generals were constantly declaring themselves emperor, marching their armies on Rome, fighting civil wars against other would-be emperors, and all the while the borders were weakening. When your armies are busy fighting each other instead of defending the empire, bad things happen. And bad things did happen. Germanic tribes started raiding across the Rhine and Danube. The Sassanid Persians invaded from the east. Entire provinces were overrun, cities were sacked, and the empire that had once seemed invincible was suddenly looking very vulnerable. The economy was in freefall during this period. Trade routes were disrupted by constant warfare. Pirates infested the Mediterranean. Inflation skyrocketed as emperors debased the currency, mixing cheaper metals into silver coins to stretch their resources. At the beginning of the 3rd century, Roman silver coins were about 95% pure silver. By the end of the century, they were less than 5% silver, mostly just cheap bronze or copper. People lost faith in the currency, prices soared, and the economic system that had held the empire together started to break down. Workers abandoned their trades because they couldn't afford to live. Farmers left their fields because they couldn't pay the taxes. Cities shrank as people fled to the countryside, hoping to survive by farming small plots of land. Now Rome did recover from the crisis of the 3rd century, at least partially. Emperors like Diocletian and Constantine managed to stabilize things in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. Diocletian split the empire into eastern and western halves, with 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors ruling together. This was supposed to make the empire easier to govern, and for a while it worked. Constantine moved the capital from Rome to a new city he built on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. He renamed it Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and it would serve as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. Constantine also did something that would change the course of history. He converted to Christianity and made it the official religion of the empire. Christianity, which had been a persecuted minority religion just decades earlier, was now the faith of the empire itself. But these reforms, while impressive, couldn't solve Rome's fundamental problems. The empire was still too big, still too expensive to maintain, and still facing enormous external pressures, and those pressures were about to get a whole lot worse. Let's talk about the barbarians. Now, when we say barbarians, we need to be careful. The Romans used this term to describe anyone who wasn't Roman, anyone who didn't speak Latin or Greek, anyone who lived outside the empire's borders. But these weren't mindless hordes of savages. These were complex societies with their own cultures, traditions, and political systems. The Germanic tribes that lived beyond Rome's northern borders, people like the Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Saxons, they were farmers, warriors, and traders. Many of them had been in contact with Rome for centuries, trading with Romans, serving in Roman armies, and adopting aspects of Roman culture. Some of their leaders spoke Latin, wore Roman-style clothing, and admired Roman civilization even as they fought against it. But in the 4th and 5th centuries, something changed. These tribes weren't just raiding anymore, they were migrating, moving in massive numbers across Roman territory, and they weren't coming because they wanted to destroy Rome. They were coming because they were running away from something even more terrifying. That something was the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, fierce warriors on horseback who swept into Europe in the late 4th century like a tidal wave. They were unlike anything the Germanic tribes had ever faced, mobile, ruthless, and seemingly unstoppable. As the Huns pushed westward, they displaced the Germanic tribes who had been living along Rome's borders. These tribes had a choice: stay and fight the Huns, which would likely mean annihilation, or move into Roman territory and hope for protection, or at least a chance at survival. Most chose the latter. In 376 AD, the Goths appeared at the Roman border along the Danube River. They were refugees, hundreds of thousands of them, men, women, and children, fleeing from the Huns. They begged the Romans to let them cross the river and settle within the empire. The Roman emperor at the time, Valens, saw an opportunity. He agreed to let them in, but with conditions. The Goths would be disarmed, settled in designated areas, and would provide soldiers for the Roman army. It seemed like a win-win situation. Rome would get new recruits for its overstretched military, and the Goths would get safety from the Huns. But things went wrong almost immediately. The Roman officials in charge of the resettlement were corrupt and incompetent. They extorted the Goths, selling them food at exorbitant prices, even selling them dog meat when supplies ran low. The Goths were starving, desperate, and angry. Within a few years they rebelled. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Gothic warriors faced off against the Roman army led by Emperor Valens himself. It was a disaster for Rome. The Roman army was destroyed and Valens was killed in the fighting. This was the first time in centuries that a Roman emperor had died in battle against barbarians. The message was clear: Rome could no longer protect its borders, and the barbarians knew it. Over the next century, the Western Roman Empire slowly unraveled. The Visigoths, the same Goths who had rebelled, eventually settled in Gaul and Spain with Rome's reluctant permission. The Vandals crossed into Gaul, then Spain, then North Africa, where they established their own kingdom and cut off Rome's vital grain supply from Africa. The Franks moved into northern Gaul. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed the North Sea into Britain after the Roman legions withdrew. Everywhere you looked, barbarian tribes were carving out pieces of the empire for themselves. Sometimes they came as conquerors, sometimes as allies or federates of Rome, but the result was the same. Roman authority was collapsing, and then came Attila the Hun. Between 434 and 453 AD, Attila led the Huns on a rampage across Europe. He invaded the Eastern Roman Empire, sacked cities, and extracted enormous tribute payments. Then he turned west and invaded Gaul. The Romans, now desperate, allied with their former enemies, the Visigoths, to fight off the Huns. In 451 AD, at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in what is now France, a combined Roman and Gothic army managed to stop Attila's advance. It was one of the largest battles of the ancient world, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. Attila retreated, but the next year he invaded Italy itself. Cities fell before him, and legend says that Pope Leo the Great personally met with Attila and convinced him to spare Rome. Whatever actually happened, Attila did withdraw, and he died shortly afterward in 453 AD. The Hunnic Empire collapsed without his leadership, but the damage to Rome was done. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a shell of its former self. The emperor in Rome, if there even was one, controlled little more than Italy and parts of Gaul. Real power lay with barbarian generals who commanded what remained of the Roman army. In 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer decided he'd had enough of the charade. He deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. Ironic names, considering the first king of Rome was Romulus, and the first emperor was Augustus. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia, the crown and purple robes, to the emperor in Constantinople, and declared that there was no longer any need for a Western emperor. The Roman Senate was disbanded. The Western Roman Empire, after over 1,000 years of history, was officially over. Now, here's something important to understand. At the time, this might not have seemed like the end of the world. Life didn't change overnight for most people. The borders had been crumbling for decades. Barbarian kings had been running things for years, but symbolically this was enormous. Rome, the eternal city, the center of civilization, had fallen. There was no longer a Roman emperor in the West. The political unity that had held Europe together was gone, and in its place came fragmentation, chaos, and what historians would later call the Dark Ages. So what were the Dark Ages actually like? Well, first of all, we should acknowledge that the term Dark Ages is somewhat controversial among historians today. It's called dark partly because we have fewer written records from this period, making it harder to study, and partly because it was genuinely a time of decline in many ways. But it wasn't uniformly dark everywhere, and it wasn't without its own achievements and developments. That said, for Western Europe, particularly in the centuries immediately following Rome's fall, life got a lot harder for a lot of people. The first and most obvious change was political fragmentation. The unified Roman Empire was replaced by dozens of small kingdoms and principalities, many of them ruled by barbarian kings. The Franks controlled much of Gaul, the Visigoths held Spain, the Vandals ruled North Africa, the Ostrogoths took over Italy, the Angles and Saxons divided up Britain. These kingdoms were constantly fighting each other, forming and breaking alliances and struggling to establish any kind of stable authority. There was no central government, no empire-wide legal system, no unified military. It was every kingdom for itself. This political chaos had immediate economic consequences. Remember those amazing Roman roads we talked about? They started to fall apart. Without a central government to maintain them, roads deteriorated, bridges collapsed, and travel became dangerous. Trade, which had flourished under Roman rule, contracted dramatically. The Mediterranean, which the Romans had called Mare Nostrum, our sea, became dangerous. Pirates and raiders made sea travel risky. Long-distance trade declined, and with it went the economic specialization that had made the Roman economy so productive. Cities, which had been centers of trade and administration, shrank dramatically. Rome itself, which had been home to over 1 million people, saw its population collapse to maybe 30 or 40,000 by the 7th century. Other cities suffered similar fates. Urban life, which had been the hallmark of Roman civilization, largely disappeared in Western Europe. As cities declined, people retreated to the countryside. Europe became a patchwork of rural estates, small villages, and isolated farms. This was the beginning of what we call feudalism, though that system wouldn't fully develop for a few more centuries. People sought protection from local strongmen, lords who could offer some measure of security in an increasingly dangerous world. In exchange for protection, peasants worked the land, giving a portion of their harvest to their lord. It was subsistence farming, people growing just enough to survive, with little surplus for trade or specialization. The standard of living declined dramatically. Things that had been common in Roman times, like glass windows, stone buildings, literacy, running water, and public baths, became rare luxuries or disappeared entirely. Literacy rates plummeted. In the Roman Empire, literacy had been fairly widespread, at least among the middle and upper classes. But as the economy declined and urban centers disappeared, schools closed. Books were expensive to produce, as they had to be copied by hand, and with fewer people who could read, there was less demand for them. Knowledge that had been carefully preserved and transmitted for centuries was lost. Libraries burned, manuscripts rotted, and entire genres of Roman literature disappeared. We know of dozens of Roman authors whose works are mentioned in other texts, but whose writings have been completely lost. The scientific and philosophical achievements of the ancient world were largely forgotten in Western Europe, though thankfully they were preserved by scholars in the Byzantine Empire and later in the Islamic world. The loss of literacy and learning had profound effects. Without written records, legal systems became less sophisticated. Instead of written contracts and laws, society relied more on oral tradition and custom. Justice became more arbitrary, more dependent on the whims of local lords than on established legal principles. Medical knowledge declined as the writings of Roman physicians like Galen were lost or forgotten. Life expectancy, which had been relatively high in the Roman Empire, dropped significantly. Infant mortality soared. Diseases that Roman doctors had been able to treat became deadly again. Technology also regressed in many areas. The sophisticated engineering techniques the Romans had developed were forgotten. The formula for Roman concrete, which had allowed them to build massive structures like the Pantheon with its enormous unsupported dome, was lost and wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. Metalworking techniques declined. The quality of pottery and glassware decreased. Some historians estimate that the technological level of Western Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries was roughly comparable to what it had been in the Bronze Age, over 1,000 years earlier. That's how dramatic the decline was. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural and psychological. For centuries, people in Western Europe had identified as Romans. They had seen themselves as part of a great civilization that stretched back over 1,000 years. They had taken pride in Roman law, Roman literature, Roman engineering. Now all of that was gone. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Rome had their own cultures, their own languages, their own traditions. Latin continued to be used by the Church, but in daily life, it fragmented into various Romance languages like French, Spanish, and Italian, while in other areas, Germanic languages like English and German dominated. The sense of being part of a unified civilization was lost, replaced by a much more localized tribal identity. Religion became the one unifying force in Western Europe. The Catholic Church, based in Rome and led by the Pope, survived the fall of the empire and actually grew stronger in many ways. As political authority collapsed, the Church stepped in to fill the void. Monasteries became centers of learning, preserving what they could of classical knowledge. Monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, keeping alive some remnants of Roman literature and learning. The Church provided a sense of continuity, a connection to the past, and a hope for the future. Christianity spread among the barbarian tribes, and gradually, a new Christian European civilization began to emerge, though it would take centuries to fully develop. The Church also provided some semblance of social services that the Roman state had once provided. Monasteries and churches cared for the sick and the poor. They provided education, at least for those training to be clergy. They settled disputes and provided a measure of justice. Bishops often became the real leaders of cities, more important than any secular ruler. The Pope in Rome claimed spiritual authority over all of Western Christendom, and while his political power was limited, his moral authority was immense. But let's be clear, life for the average person in the Dark Ages was hard, really hard. Most people were peasants, tied to the land, working from dawn to dusk just to survive. Famines were common. When harvests failed, people starved by the thousands. There were no social safety nets, no granaries storing surplus food for hard times like Rome had maintained. Disease was rampant, and medical care was primitive at best. Warfare was constant, as local lords fought over land and resources. Raiders, whether Vikings from the north, Muslims from the south, or Magyars from the east, were a constant threat in later centuries. Life was, to borrow a phrase from the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, I mentioned earlier that the term Dark Ages is controversial, and I want to address that. It's important to recognize that this period wasn't uniformly dark everywhere. The Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, thrived throughout this period. Constantinople remained a great city, wealthy and sophisticated. Byzantine scholars preserved classical knowledge, maintained Roman legal traditions, and created magnificent works of art and architecture. The Hagia Sophia, built in Constantinople in the 6th century, was the largest church in the world for nearly 1,000 years and remains one of the greatest architectural achievements in human history. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was experiencing a golden age. After the rapid expansion of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, Islamic scholars translated Greek and Roman texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that would have otherwise been lost. They made major advances in mathematics, inventing algebra, making breakthroughs in astronomy and medicine, and creating a vibrant literary and philosophical culture. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba were centers of learning and culture that far outshone anything in Western Europe at the time. Even in Western Europe, there were bright spots. Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire, became a center of Christian learning in the 6th and 7th centuries. Irish monks traveled across Europe, founding monasteries and spreading literacy. The court of Charlemagne in the late 8th and early 9th centuries saw a brief cultural flowering known as the Carolingian Renaissance, with renewed interest in classical learning and attempts to standardize education and law. But for all these exceptions, the general trend in Western Europe from roughly 500 to 1000 AD was one of decline, fragmentation, and loss. The achievements of Roman civilization, the infrastructure, the learning, the political unity, the economic prosperity, all of it faded away. Europe became poorer, more violent, and more isolated. It would take centuries for Western Europe to recover and surpass the level of civilization that Rome had achieved. So why does all this matter? Why should we care about events that happened 1500 years ago? Well, the fall of Rome and the Dark Ages that followed shaped the world we live in today in profound ways. First, it demonstrates the fragility of civilization. Rome seemed invincible, eternal, too big and too advanced to ever fall. But it did fall, and when it did, centuries of progress were lost. It's a sobering reminder that civilization is not inevitable, that it requires constant maintenance, wise leadership, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Second, the fall of Rome shows us the importance of institutions. When Rome's political institutions collapsed, when its legal system broke down, when its military could no longer defend its borders, everything else collapsed with it. Strong institutions matter. They provide stability, predictability, and the framework for human cooperation on a large scale. When they fail, chaos follows. Third, the Dark Ages shaped the political geography of modern Europe. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged from Rome's ruins eventually evolved into modern European nations. France grew out of the Frankish kingdom, Spain emerged from the Visigothic kingdom, England was forged by the Anglo-Saxon invaders. The linguistic and cultural patterns established during this period still influence Europe today. Fourth, the Church's role during the Dark Ages established patterns that would shape European history for the next 1,000 years. The relationship between secular and religious authority, the tension between kings and popes, the role of the Church in education and learning, all of this has its roots in the post-Roman world. Even today, Christianity remains a major cultural force in Europe and the Americas. And much of that is because the Church survived the fall of Rome and provided continuity through the Dark Ages. Finally, the eventual recovery from the Dark Ages, the Renaissance and the rebirth of learning in the later medieval period, was fueled by the rediscovery of classical knowledge that had been preserved during those dark centuries. When scholars in 12th and 13th century Europe began translating Arabic texts, which had themselves been translated from Greek and Latin, they reconnected with the intellectual heritage of Rome and Greece. This sparked an intellectual revolution that eventually led to the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the modern world. So, in a strange way, we owe our modern civilization not just to Rome's achievements, but also to the fact that some of those achievements were preserved through the darkest period of European history. Looking at the big picture, the fall of Rome was one of the great turning points in human history. It marked the end of antiquity and the beginning of the medieval world. It showed that even the mightiest empire can fall, that progress is not linear, and that civilization must be actively maintained and defended. The Dark Ages that followed were a time of hardship and loss, but they were also a time of transformation. Out of the ruins of Rome, a new European civilization would eventually emerge, one that would go on to shape the entire world. Today, historians continue to debate the causes of Rome's fall. Was it the barbarian invasions, the economic crisis, political instability, the rise of Christianity changing Roman values? Probably it was all of these factors and more working together in complex ways. Rome didn't fall because of one thing, it fell because multiple systems failed at the same time, creating a cascade of collapse that couldn't be stopped. And the lesson for us today is clear. Civilizations are complex, interconnected systems. When multiple parts start failing simultaneously, the whole thing can unravel faster than anyone expects. So the next time you see a crumbling Roman ruin, a piece of ancient road, or a fragment of a Roman aqueduct, remember what it represents. It's not just a relic of an ancient empire. It's a reminder of what humanity can achieve when we work together, and what we can lose when those achievements aren't protected. The Romans built an empire that lasted 1,000 years and brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to the Mediterranean world. But empires don't last forever. They rise, they flourish, and eventually they fall. And when they do, the world changes in ways that echo through the centuries. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the fall of Rome and the Dark Ages, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what period of history you'd like me to cover next. Should we explore the Byzantine Empire, the rise of Islam, the Viking Age? Let me know your thoughts. And as always, thanks for joining me on this journey through history. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and remember that understanding the past helps us make sense of the present and prepare for the future. See you in the next video.